A few places in the U.S. have undergone extreme flooding. Kerr County, Texas, and New Mexico, Reduso, from July 4th to July 8th, have had flash flooding. Many people have died. People are still missing. And conversations are happening of what happened. Were people alerted? How did those alerts go out? How were they received, if they were received? And how are people building infrastructure around rivers where there's been flooding in the past? I wanted to make sure that you, as the audience for the How to Protect the Ocean podcast, understood some of the conversations that are going on. There's a lot going on in the news. A lot of people are making it very political because of the cuts that happened over the last couple months in the US federally. And I wanted to kind of sift through all that, right? Really sift through the BS to say, what actually happened? Did the cuts affect the messaging system? Did the cuts affect the ability for the message to get out there? Or was it just a fact that this was a very bad circumstance caused by more moisture in the air and a confluence of storms and clouds with moisture and, just bad circumstances? Or is it all of the above? To the bottom of that, I wanted to get some answers. And Dave Jones, the CEO of StormCenter, has come on the podcast before to talk about, storms and alert systems and weather. And he's a meteorologist for a very, very long time, a good friend of the podcast. And he graciously accepted to come on the podcast and talk about how the messaging system went out, how it could be better done in the future, and what needs to be done so that we can alert more people faster and they can get out and they can have all the information for them, plus the feedback systems that happen and what needs to happen in the future. Before we go on with the podcast, I want to be sensitive to the fact that people have had their lives just, it's been awful for people. It's been a huge tragedy. I want to acknowledge that. The reason why I'm putting this podcast out now is because as the Central Texas and Kerr County floods were happening in the river there, another flood happened in New Mexico. So these floods are happening. We're at a time of year where there's a lot of moisture in the air because of humidity, and it's the summer. And so I want to make sure that people, if they can have the ability to get the right NOAA weather radios or whatever they need, they will have it, and that they'll be on alert and they understand the impacts of these dangerous situations. So hence why I'm putting it out now, is to be cognizant of that and to help people in the near future. So here's the episode. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin. This is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. On today's episode, it's a bit of a somber note. We are talking about the flash floods that happened in Kerr County in Texas, as well as in New Mexico. People have lost their lives. People are still missing. The rescue efforts are ongoing. But I want to have Dave Jones on to talk about what went on during the storm. How are people alerted in these areas that are more vulnerable to flash floods? And what can we do about it in the future? And for those communities that are in a similar situation that haven't had floods yet, but might have them in the future, what they can do and how they can better prepare themselves in the future so that this doesn't happen in their county, in their town. So I wanted to have Dave Jones on to discuss this. He's been on the podcast before. He's been a meteorologist for a long, long time. He's the CEO of StormCenter right now, which provides extra coverage of the weather to his clients, but also has a YouTube channel, which I'll link in the show notes, where you can get updated, live updates a lot of the times on hurricanes, on storms, and so forth, and you can better protect yourself and better be alerted. So he helps amplify the messages. He doesn't put out the messages, but he helps amplify the messages coming up from the National Weather Service and NOAA, and he does a damn good job at it. So he was gracious enough to take time away from the work that he's doing to help educate myself, as well as everybody here that's listening to this podcast and watching this podcast, in order to better protect themselves wherever you live. I live here in Canada. Watching this from Canada is awful. We've seen this happen in our country, but to watch it anywhere around the world and see people in pain and have to undergo this tragedy is just awful. And our hearts go out to everybody and their families who are going through this. But I wanted to make sure that we had the education here so that we can protect ourselves in the future. So without further ado, here is Dave Jones talking about the flash floods that happened in Texas and New Mexico, how we can better prepare ourselves, and how the system works and how it can work even better in the future. Enjoy, and I'll talk to you after. Hey, Dave, welcome back to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about some flooding that's happening in the U.S. right now?
Unfortunately, I'm ready.
Yeah, it's
Yes.
when I contacted you to come on the podcast, I was like, he's going to be busy, he's going to be tired, just not only mentally and physically, but emotionally. I mean, there are some big tragedies happening in Texas, in New Mexico. There are over 120 people that have confirmed that have died in these flash floods in Texas. There's about 4 individuals that are missing, 3 people killed, including 2 children in New Mexico. Horrendous, flooding, horrendous tragedy, and of course, people are still missing. And this is what we wanted to avoid. We always want to avoid this type of stuff. We talk, and in this, as everything is developing, and as still people are trying to be found, and rescuers are doing their best and braving the elements to get out there in very difficult situations and very dangerous situations to rescue and find some of these missing people. There's some blame and a lot of stuff being thrown back and forth, and unfortunately, a lot of it's political. A lot of Doge cuts that we talked about on the last podcast. From NOAA, the National Weather Service, what we were afraid of. But it seems like a lot of political stuff is like, let's blame one side, let's blame the other side. I want to strip away that, Dave, today, and I want to kind of just talk about the process of what is supposed to happen, and if that happened during this, like the early warning systems, making sure people were safe, or they knew about these types of storms and these types of floods, how these floods occurred. And maybe we'll start off with that, Dave. Can you just talk, because you've got the knowledge on this way more than I do. Can you just let the audience know, like, what happened in the first place? How did these floods happen?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. And we always look back. Of course, we can see things developing in the future, but we can't tell, days and days and days ahead of time how much rain is going to fall in a certain watershed or over a certain town. That is really an elusive thing as far as forecasting goes. But we can see the conditions coming together that will result in flooding somewhere. And that's what happened, Andrew, over the last, several days, even before July 4th and the terrible flood happened. We had a lot of moisture that was in the air. And typically there's a give and take for moisture and dry air over Texas. And we had a landfalling tropical storm in Mexico several days before that was kind of, rained out in Mexico, but that circulation stayed there, and it brought with it, when it moved over Texas, even more moisture. And so, you and I might notice it as, boy, it's really humid out today.
Yeah.
It got a lot more humid than yesterday. It doesn't mean that remnants of that system was bringing any rain itself or bringing any thunderstorms, but it was bringing the moisture. And at the same time, there was a circulation around a high pressure system that was off the southeast coast of the United States that was bringing in more moisture from the Gulf. And that happens very frequently in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
So you have those two things that are coming together. And then you had a little disturbance in the atmosphere that was leading to the development of thunderstorms in south central Texas. And when you don't have a lot of steering currents, but you have a lot of moisture and you get thunderstorms to develop, you get thunderstorms that develop and don't move very quickly. There's no real push to
Right.
get them out of the way. And so when those thunderstorms develop, they tap into that very thick layer of tropical moisture. It's continuing to be fed by moisture coming in off of the Gulf around the circulation, around a high pressure system. And those thunderstorms just kind of sit there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happened over Kerr County in Texas, and just north of Kerr County. These thunderstorms formed and they just kept reforming. We call it training, when
Oh, wow.
thunderstorms
Okay.
move over the same place at the same time. And that is the recipe for flash flooding. So when you think about that, you think about that moisture and the storms going and all that stuff, you think, well, what about absorption? Can't the The land absorbed
Right.
that rain coming down. And the hill country of South Central Texas is very much thin soil and a lot of rock. And
Mm.
it's very hard there. And so they had been in a drought for a long period of time. So you have very hard soil. You have not very thick soil for absorbing any kind of rain, and nothing's going to absorb 12 to 15 to perhaps 20 inches of rain over a several hour period. Um, that rain has to go somewhere, and it drains right down into the watershed and into the local river, in this case, the Guadalupe River, which surged more than 30 feet
That's
after
unreal.
all that rain fell.
Now, we talk about storms that happen like this, and you mentioned how this just seemed to be this time, this coincidence in a way where all these systems are kind of converging in one place. You have over an area where you have a lot of rock, and so the absorption of the soil and thin soil, not a lot of absorption is going to happen. This seems to be just a case of bad luck, but we talk about when we do, I've done this in the past when I did private consulting. We talk about 100-year storms, which are really bad storms, 50-year storms, 10-year storms, and all these different types of storms. And engineers and planners, they build and they plan for these types of storms to happen every so often. So these 100-year storms, these 10-year storms. For a storm like this, I know it might be early to say, do we know what kind of category these storms have? Like, has this happened before in these areas where similar consequences or similar results?
They have. And in Kerr County and along the Guadalupe River, they've had several major floods over the course of the last 100 years. And, I hear in the media, I hear other people saying, oh my gosh, this was a 1 in 1,000 year event. Well, I've always been an advocate to say, let's throw that out the window. Okay.
Right.
Let's stop talking about 1 in 1,000 year event. Let's not talk about 1 in 100 year event, because we are living in a different paradigm as far as the atmosphere is concerned. It is basically turbocharged with heat and moisture. And so we can't look at past events and say, oh, this is not going to happen again. Anybody that says that this flood that just happened isn't going to happen for another 200 to 500 years is not accurate. And we're going to see more of these kind of floods happening, not just in the United States, but in many countries around the world, because we have that much more moisture in the atmosphere. And so, yes, they've had floods there. Many of the structures that were washed away were in flood zones. Some areas, including the Mystic Cabin retreat area, was in an extreme flood zone. Who knows how they were able to build there? And they also apparently had an emergency plan and had an inspection 2 days before this happened and passed that inspection. So I don't know what the inspection was for,
Right.
but it's certainly opening up a lot of questions to what do people do, especially if they're taking money and taking and housing people and having activities in a dangerous area when it could flood. What are the plans that were
Hmm.
in place? I'd love to see those emergency plans, and I'd love to see what is the history. I'm starting to get information from several colleagues around what is the information in the past as to why they didn't have warning systems in place
Yeah.
in that area.
Yeah. It's interesting when we look at the coastal areas all around the world. They're always updating tsunami warnings. They're always updating coastal warnings, coastal hazards, sea surges, and so forth. And you'd expect the same thing to happen, especially when you just what you just mentioned, is they had an inspection and stuff. And I feel as though, as you mentioned earlier, how it's a different game than it was even 30 years ago, even 10 years ago. The atmosphere has changed. So it's a different game. Using the 1,000-year storms, 100-year storms, 10-year storms, it may not be appropriate at this point, because we know they're going to be more frequent, and the atmosphere in itself, as you've described a lot in this podcast episode, is it's thick and it's ready to go, and we're seeing a lot different. And I said this a couple of years ago when here in Ontario we had flash flooding, and I said climate change is going to expose the vulnerabilities of cities that haven't done the necessary adaptations and plans. And this is not to, because like I don't want to blame anybody, especially what's going on now as people are still being rescued. I want to be cognizant of that. But that, unfortunately, when looking at people like cities and towns and villages that are dry right now, that are watching this, this is the lesson that they have to take, and being like, we do inspections, we do, routes, and I think, are these routes good? Are they still good? Like, let's run these models again. Let's make sure that our infrastructure is in place, where we look at where the risks are. We look at the floodplains, we look at, our people, should people be in there? If they're in this area and they're allowed to be in this area, do they have the necessary equipment and ability to get out? There's a lot of stuff that can go on in an emergency, as you know. And how many hours did it rise from 5 or 7 feet to 37 feet?
Yeah, estimates are between 1 and 2 hours.
That's not a lot of time to get out of the Dodge, especially to recognize. Like, I've seen some of the videos, Dave, and you worry that what's true, what's not, but it's not what you think in terms of the rise. You would almost think that somebody's looking at it and it's just rising up, rising up, rising up. It didn't really happen that way, right? It happened where it was a gush, like coming around the corner. You just see this wave in a river, which you're just like, how does this happen? And it's coming and rushing at you. It's not just rising this way, it's coming for you, in that kind of manner, which is devastating and scary altogether. And so when you think about it in that rise, you think just straight up, but it's coming at you and up, and it's coming at pretty fast speeds.
Yeah,
right?
and when Andrew, when you think about that water coming down, let's just say it's moving at 7 miles per hour, which is pretty fast.
Yeah.
For water, it exerts the same pressure on a person as a Category 5 hurricane. And then when you make it 10, 20, 30 feet high, it's off the charts. Nothing can withstand the power of that much water coming down. And when you think about a thunderstorm, think about a hilly area, the topography, all this rain coming down along in those hills, all that water is running down towards the lowest spot. And where it meets is where these rivers are. That's why rivers are there. And when they all come together, all that water rushing over all those hills, down all those hills, and it merges together into a river or two, you are going to get a phenomenal rise in that level.
Unreal. Now, so we know what happened in terms of the storm and what it did. Let's talk warning systems. Let's talk how are people warned about these types of storms, and what is the process that happens from what you see? Because you kind of see a little bit behind the scenes. Now, you are not working for the government at this point. You have your own. You have StormCenter Communications. That you're the CEO of that. That's what you do. You provide information to people online, like through YouTube, and you also have your own clients where you provide that and provide more analysis and so forth. But for people who are in a situation like in, Central Texas and Kerr County, how are they getting their updates, and how is it normally supposed to go?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. One that's going to be analyzed for a while, and hopefully quick solutions will come up. Most areas like Kerr County or in rural areas around the country have a couple of ways of getting warnings from the National Weather Service. And the National Weather Service, first of all, is the official and authoritative voice for issuing watches and warnings. So I can't stand up as the CEO of StormCenter Communications and say, I'm issuing a flash flood warning for this town.
Right.
Right. I can't do that.
Right.
What we do is we immediately pass on those warnings and watches and advisories from the National Weather Service. And so there are two main ways that they can get that information. One is through the Wireless Emergency Alert System. It's called WEA here in the United States, where the National Weather Service issues a warning. They activate the WEA Emergency Alert System, and then that sends out across all cell towers those alerts. And your phone will go
That's where
off.
you get that emergency message that pops up when
You'll get that emergency
yeah.
message that pops up if you haven't turned it off on your phone, and
Right.
if you have a signal and you have connectivity.
Yeah.
The other way which you can get those warnings is through NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is a standalone radio that has AM/FM bands. As a matter of fact, I actually have one. It's right here.
This is the one I think you were showing the other day on your social media. I saw this.
Yeah. So this is what it looks like. I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah. If you just move it over just a little bit to your right, I believe.
There you go.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank
I'll
you.
just unplug it.
Yeah.
I don't have batteries in this one, but I'll put the antenna down. This is the NOAA Weather Radio, and you can program it for the area in which you live. You know, you go through a menu and then you find out what section you're in, what state, what county, and then what sub region you're in. And this radio is constantly monitoring through radio signals when the Weather Service issues an alert, whether it's a watch or a warning. And there are lights here. Right here it says warning. Over here it says watch. And those lights stay lit while that is in effect. And then all you have to do when you get an alert is you hit this button, and then the National Weather Service computerized voice comes across and says, the National Weather Service has issued a flash flood warning for Kerr County in Texas for the Guadalupe River. It's rising rapidly, and then they give instructions.
Interesting. Okay.
So what we know is that in some areas along the Guadalupe River, the cell signal is terrible. So they don't have great connectivity. But the other thing that I do know is that NOAA Weather Radio completely covers Kerr County. So if everyone along the river had a NOAA Weather Radio, they would have had the radios go off and alert them. Now, that's one part of the equation, right? Getting the alert. The second part of the equation is understanding the alert. So what was communicated through NOAA Weather Radio is another thing to look at. And we know because it's the same information that's sent through the internet to all of our systems. You know, I was seeing those warnings coming in, and, you know, I could read them, and it's exactly what NOAA Weather Radio was saying. But then the other challenge is, was anybody monitoring a NOAA Weather Radio when if they had a NOAA Weather Radio? And did they know what to do when they heard about that flash flood warning? Because I can certainly tell you that the flood warnings issued do not specifically identify all the camps and RV campgrounds along the river. Right. So maybe people were listening to, the Mystic Camp. They didn't mention that. I don't know.
Yeah, because
or they didn't mention the specific RV.
There could be so many. There could be so many, right? Yeah.
And you have to have situational awareness for what a warning means and how it applies to where you are and where you're going to be spending time.
Right.
And so the other way in which you can get warnings is, through other internet connected devices, right? I mean, uh, for example, we developed a technology called GeoCollaborate, which allows you to collaborate across
Yeah.
different platforms. If there was a warning issued, then that area would light up,
Mm-hmm.
and then you click on it and then you see what the warning is. That's not the most proactive way to get a warning. No weather radio really is. And then to have somebody monitoring no weather radio and then saying, I am going to ring this bell,
Yeah.
or I'm going to run and knock on every cabin's door and say, it's plan
Yeah.
A,
Yeah.
meet at this location right now. Don't even get your shoes on.
Right. Like,
Let's
we
get
need to
going.
go.
So these are the kind of questions that we need to ask. And I mean, some people have said to me, why are you looking at what needs to happen now and all that stuff? They're still looking for victims. And I said, you know what? From a meteorologist perspective, who does not live in Texas,
Mm-hmm.
we're all grieving, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're all
Absolutely. Even up here in
grieving.
Canada.
And that's right. People around the world are grieving, and
Mm-hmm.
we're all looking at what can we do to help.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't get down there and dig under trees and try to move cars. And there are a lot of people down there doing that right now. So the way in which we can do that is to think about not letting this happen again.
Mm-hmm.
And what can we do? How can we contribute to warning systems, understanding more, creating better products, and it really does in many cases come down to people believing the warning.
Right. I mean,
People
we
understanding
even
the
saw
warning.
this with Hurricane Katrina, where people stayed even, when they were told to evacuate. There are always going to be people who ignore the warnings, ignore the evacuations. They don't heed the dangers. Right.
Right. Right. And if you hear that warning and you just turn it off
Mm-hmm.
because you get a lot of warnings that never mean anything,
Mm-hmm.
that's something that we have to look at as meteorologists, as the National Weather Service. What is it that they can do differently to make this one seem
Yes.
above and beyond?
Yes.
And
Make it a
and
little bit more urgent.
yeah, a little bit more urgent. And that's why the Weather Service came up with flash flood emergency, right? They give
Okay.
flash flood warnings, flash flood warning for here, flash flood warning for there. But when there's a flash flood emergency, their hope is that people will hear the word emergency and listen closer to where that impacts and then take action. And that's exactly what a flash flood emergency means.
Yeah.
And indeed, a flash flood emergency was issued.
Gotcha. Now, when we, one thing to notice too is to remark, as we discuss what can be done in the future, I also want to kind of let us know, like we're focusing right now on Texas, but not long after, maybe like 3 or 4 days after, on July 8th, we saw a flash flood in New Mexico, and unfortunately, people perished. Some individuals are still missing. So this is why, like, it could happen. We're in a situation right now. We're in a time of year where in certain areas are more vulnerable than others. So even people who are understanding what's happening over in Texas, over in New Mexico, if they're in somewhere else, they may be like, maybe we should go get a NOAA radio, or figure out how to get that. Maybe we should start looking more on our town or village or our city's website and find out where the evacuation routes are, or even
Right.
talk to our council person or our government representative of, like, what do we do in this emergency? What is actually an emergency that we should be really looking out for? And I think it's important to that. And that's why I want to cover it in this episode, because you just never know when it's going to hit, especially in a summer where we're getting humidity all across North America, where the rains are going to start to come. We've been having drought conditions, and when those rains come, they come hard, and
Yep.
it could be very dangerous. And the
Yeah.
situation with these radios, this is the first time I've heard of these radios that were still available. Is this given out by the local governments or like the government initiatives, or are these just purchased at like your Radio Shack or Circuit City or Best Buy or whatever store?
Yeah, yeah, you can. That's a great question, and you can purchase these. You can get on, any online retailer that sells this kind of stuff and order them.
Okay.
In many cases, state or county governments will buy a whole big lot of them and give
Okay.
them out to
Especially in
their.
areas that you really need them. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember speaking with a friend of mine and colleague who is the spokesperson for Midland Radio, which is a manufacturer of
Hmm.
no weather radios, um, said that in some cases, areas or counties or towns who decided, and I want to talk about sirens as well,
Right.
who decided not to install sirens or to take down their sirens
Hmm.
and use that budget to buy no weather radios and give them to
Oh, okay. Okay.
uh, their citizens.
So it wasn't
Um,
just the fact that they're just taking it down because they don't want to use them anymore. They're taking them down, but replacing them with something probably a little bit more with more information, like these NOAA radios.
More information, and a radio signal reaches a lot further than a siren.
Understand? True. True.
And many studies have happened where sirens have been put in places, and unfortunately, they're not made to penetrate your house.
Right.
So you may not hear a siren. You may be watching TV. You may be having your headphones on. You may be sleeping, and you don't hear the sirens. Now, people who live close to the sirens are going to hear them, but there have been instances around the country where towns have invested in these sirens, and you're talking anywhere between $100,000 and $500,000 a year. You have to pay for maintenance and keeping them up, installing them, all that kind of stuff. What else can you do with that money that might give everybody an alert in their own home? And NOAA weather radio is certainly an option.
Yeah.
Um,
What's interesting
yeah.
too is like, you think about radios. You know, when I grew up, radio was a still pretty big thing. You listened to it in your car, you could listen to them at home. There was no iPhones or MP3s or internet even when in the 80s when I was a kid. Um, and so radios were a pretty big thing. When my parents were growing up, that's what they listened to. That was their
Mhm.
entertainment. So everything was listened over the radio. We
Right.
have a lot of different technologies nowadays in our homes, phones, wireless internet, TVs and so forth. And those can go down. Power outages can really go. The radio frequencies from these radios really are powerful. Do you think that even though it's so powerful, people don't think they're as advanced because they're from a futuristic standpoint they look like their old technology, and some people may not rely on them as much? Do you think there's has that ever come across your conversations with the maybe lack of uptake from some communities?
Yeah, I really haven't heard that, the fact that it's a radio, people might not be interested in using it. They'd rather, have some AI bot
Right.
blanket their phone or something,
Right.
And the problem is that in many areas, particularly uh, very rural areas, there may not be cellular signals. And
Hmm.
if you don't have a
Hmm.
cellular signal, then you're basically carrying a brick
Yeah.
around
True.
in your pocket that's not going
True.
to tell you anything. And the no weather radio does penetrate much more of the geography, and people can get it. Now, I do think that it's really an awareness
Yeah.
thing where people don't know about no weather radio. It's been around for more than 50 years. Um, the it's being threatened by cuts, budget cuts.
Hmm.
If the National Weather Service continues to take budget cuts, they've been protecting no weather radio for now.
Right.
But pretty soon, if they keep getting cut, that's going to be something that they can't afford to maintain. I
So
mean,
and this, so this, and when you mean by that, sorry to interrupt.
yeah,
When you mean by that, it's not the people who manufacture the actual radios. It's the signal that goes out to the radios to maintain that awareness,
that's
right? Those
right.
alerts.
Because they used to have, like, when NOAA the radio first started, they installed all these antennas,
Right.
transmission antennas
Yeah.
around the country for to broadcast the signals. And then that got really expensive to maintain. So they started leasing space off of existing radio towers and towers that exist out there. Well, I mean, that's like rent, it keeps going up.
Yeah.
And so they're struggling with increased costs to maintain the transmitter and to keep it on the tower that they have it on now. Um, uh, because when they issue from each forecast office, when they issue the warning, and that automatically activates the signal that sets the NOAA weather radios off.
Right.
So the
Okay.
Weather Service doesn't make the NOAA weather radios, but they provide the content that's going to save your life.
Right. Which is, if the most important, right, is
That's right.
you've got the device, they want to get you the information to go to that device and get it. I want to kind of just talk a little bit about some of the stuff that's been said over the last week or so in terms of what may have happened, what may not have happened. It sounds just from our conversation that alerts went out, but there could have been a lot of ways that people didn't get alerts: lack of cell service, lack of the technology, like the radio that would have it, power outages. So, again, lack of ability to get that data to them, or those alerts to people. We talk about cuts. We talk about the cuts that were coming, the cuts that have happened to the National Weather Service, to NOAA over the last couple of months. It's been very quick, and I know things move slowly in government a lot of the times. We know National Weather Service budget's been cut. At this point in time, I know it's early, and I know you may or may not be able to answer this. Can we say that did something go wrong from a point of view of the government, of alerts not going out due to whatever reason, whether they were cuts, whether it was like a mistake, or is that an investigation that's got to happen after, where we can get full answers?
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's a popular question too.
Yeah.
Did the cuts impact the issuance of the warning? Um, right now, there doesn't seem to be a direct correlation between cuts and the warning went out late.
Right.
The National Weather Service office in New Braunfels in San Antonio, they had extra meteorologists on staff than they normally would,
Okay.
because of the possibility or the likelihood of flooding happening. But where I do think it could have made a difference, and it can't be proven right now, and that is that their warning coordination meteorologist, every office has what they call a WCM, a warning coordination meteorologist. And their job, one of their jobs, is to be the liaison between the emergency managers and the National Weather Service, towns and the National Weather Service, and any other organizations that have an interest in getting warning information. And so these warning coordination meteorologists are just like every other employee. They were offered the early buyouts to retire as a point of force reduction mandated, across the government. And the warning coordination meteorologist took an early retirement about 8 months ago, and they have not been replaced.
Hmm.
And so, as a meteorologist, I'm thinking, well, that warning coordination meteorologist between 8 months ago and now could have been visiting all those places, telling them about the importance of the flood warnings, telling
Mm-hmm.
them the importance
Mm-hmm.
of, hey, we can flood really quickly. Be ready. We're going to issue these alerts. Would he have done that? I don't know. But the job of the WCM is to be that liaison and to make sure the emergency management community understands how the process works. The other thing I don't know is the people that this warning coordination meteorologist had such great relationships with. Did any of them change in the last 8 months?
Mm-hmm.
And if any of those changed in the last 8 months, were they getting any instruction for what those warnings mean and how should they act? Should they hear it? What kind of connectivity back to the Weather Service? Because there is a channel,
Like a feedback
it's
channel.
called NWS Chat,
Right.
where the emergency managers and media can be in a direct chat with meteorologists at the Weather Service.
Right.
What kind of activity was going on there?
That's
And
more to issue even more warnings to the public to even like help boost the information getting out. Is that it?
well,
More up to date warnings.
more about not issuing more warnings, but what do you do when you receive this warning?
Ah, okay. Gotcha.
So
More
it's like,
helpful
hey,
tips and stuff. Yeah.
there's a flash flood emergency we're issuing. That should have made every emergency manager and every police officer get up and go down to that riverbank to try to get people out of there. Right?
Yeah.
Did they know that? So there's an education behind that as well. And I just wanted to mention too that, and I haven't been able to confirm it, but I've seen it in some media reports, and I know that those specific media they have to get multiple confirmations before they report it. And that is that Kerr County had the option or an opportunity to install a siren system along the Guadalupe River where this flood happened back in 2016 or 2017. And they refused to do it. Why? I don't know. I didn't see the study that was done to say it's not worth it or whatever. I have heard officials say that installing an alert system is expensive. And so that just leads you to ask the question, well, what's expensive? And at what price do you
what's the
determine
priority here?
something is more expensive? And what did you buy with that money that could have put in an alerting system? So I'm sure I will guarantee it 1,000% that there is going to be a lot of pressure to get some sort of alerting system. I personally think throughout the country that this flood will lead to some sort of major change in the way that flood warnings are issued and consumed. And the question is going to be, how long will that take? And I mean, Andrew, we're talking about this flood. It happened, less than a week ago, or a week ago, actually today.
Yeah.
And 6 months down the road, will anybody be thinking of flash flooding?
Well, and you're right, and I think it's important. This is, we had this, like I mentioned, we had flash flooding, not as bad, obviously, but it was pretty bad. But nobody followed up. I had it in my neighborhood, in certain parts of my neighborhood, and I followed up with the people. It happened twice in a year, less than a year, and then because there weren't any fatalities, thank God, and knock on wood that it doesn't happen. But people's properties got damaged, and it happened twice, so they had to put in 2 insurance claims. Now that people are concerned that over time, like those insurances are going to go up or not covered, but nobody followed up with the region, with the city government. They were just worried about their own, insurance costs. And just to your point of, in 6 months from now, is this going to be kind of washed aside, and no pun intended, of course, and people are just going to forget about it, assuming that it's going to be dealt with, that the people that they voted into power to say, hey, what, we need to deal with this. We need to put in this siren system, because obviously it would have helped. We didn't do it the first time. This is our chance to do it. But people, I feel that they need to follow up. They need to continue, especially if you're in an area that's vulnerable and you may or may not be able to move out of that area, or you want to continue to stay in that area. I feel like you almost have to have, like, put committees together, citizen committees, to make sure that's followed up.
It's so important to do that. And I think, in Kerr County, Texas, I don't think they'll ever forget.
Mm-mm.
When you get outside of Texas and around the country, there are probably 150,000 or more locations that could be the Guadalupe River
Yeah.
in Kerr County, Texas tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And will people see this as a reason to make them move faster in getting alert systems or understanding what's available, putting things in place, getting meteorologists in to talk to them about risk and
Mm-hmm.
what their risk tolerance is? Because communities could come together and say, you know what, we want to, and this is something they don't do today, but could be in the future, where communities work together to say, okay, this is our risk tolerance. This is what we want to be warned for,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Instead of the government coming in saying we're going to issue a warning because we think this is
Yeah.
what it should be.
Yeah.
If you get
So
more
important.
community involvement and
Mm-hmm.
buy-in from people as to what you're trying to do, I think you'll get more longevity in people thinking about it and feeling more comfortable with the risk that they're undertaking.
I agree. I agree completely. That feedback mechanism is so important because that's what makes a community. That's not just, don't just let government make all the decisions, but be involved in the government and be involved with what happens around your town, city. Obviously, not trying to lay blame on anybody in this situation. This is devastating. Our hearts go out to all the people affected who have lost their loved ones and are still looking for them. It must be a horrible situation. We don't want to see this situation happen again ever. And to protect that we know the ways. I think this also speaks to a couple of things. One, that we need to invest in these monetarily as well, funding wise, into these systems. They're not cheap for a lot of times, but
Right.
they are effective when they're in. They can save a lot of people's lives. So I think that's important. I think also the fact that we pretty much went through this episode without really talking about climate change too much, and we didn't have to, because flooding is enough. Like, we know the risks of flooding. We know it's made worse by climate change, but people see this, and this is a danger, and like an extreme danger to people immediately, and this needs to be fixed. And so there's a lot of
Yeah.
things that we can do in the short term and in the long term to ensure that we can predict these things a little bit faster, just from a where it doesn't just sneak up on us, and also making sure that we have connectivity so that people can get alerts and all the different ways of getting alerts. As far as I'm
Yeah.
concerned, like, if you're in one of those areas, everybody should be given a radio. Like, that should come with
Yeah.
the
No, I
house
agree.
or apartment or anything, right?
I
Like,
agree. And another important thing is because we're in a new paradigm, and you're right, we don't have to talk about climate change. All we have to talk about is there's more moisture in the
yeah,
atmosphere. And
yeah,
yes, the atmosphere is warmer. So you're adding more ingredients
right.
to create floods in many more locations. Um, uh, and we also want to make sure that people understand we are in that new paradigm. So forecasts of flash flooding are going to be more numerous. We're
Mm-hmm.
going to talk about that a little bit more,
Mm-hmm.
and that that we need the research, right? We need research in science to understand how the atmosphere is transforming and how fast it's transforming, because that 1 in 1,000 year flood that everybody's talking about may become a 1 in 10 year
Mm-hmm.
flood at that magnitude. But then 10 years from now, it may become a 1 in 2 year flood.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so if that happens, that has to change everyone's planning for community development, urbanization, planning, storm drain size. What kind of modifications are cities and towns going to need to to manage that kind of rainfall?
mm-hmm. Absolutely. You said it perfectly. I think it's funding needs to go in that, and that can be costly, but it's necessary. And I think a lot of times it gets passed up, and it's deemed unnecessary for whatever reason, whether it's political, whether it's budgetary. But you're right, we do need to understand our system more. We are in an ever changing world, more than ever, and we need to have a better understanding of how we can adapt to it, and change it, so that hopefully we can.
That's why research needs to be funded.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Dave, I want to thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I know you're busy. I appreciate all the work you do and all the work your colleagues do. Appreciate you coming here and giving information to our audience, sifting through all the stuff on the news and being able to provide us with ways people get alerts, as well as ways they can get alerts and how they can get it in the future if they need it. So if everybody can go out and get your NOAA Watch radio, go out and get it, because it's very important to do so. I'll put if I can find some links, I'll put a link if you can purchase it online or something. So again, Dave, thank you so much. We really do appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Thank you, Dave, for joining us on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast and providing us all that information. A lot of the stuff I didn't know about, and I thought it was really interesting to find out. After all this gets sorted, investigations happen, people get to mourn their loss, people get to understand what happened and what they can do in the future. I hope that there are critical and constructive conversations from a government level and community levels with their governments in order to better protect themselves. Forget the political side of everything. Forget the two sides to every political aisle. Forget the climate change political aspect. Let's protect people. Let's make sure that we can be safe in our own communities. Whether in the US, whether you're in Canada, whether you're in Europe, doesn't matter. We want to make sure that we're protected, and governments and communities need to come together to be able to ensure that these are protected. This has nothing to do with political affiliations. This has to do with protecting people, with protecting children. 27 children were killed because they were at a camp that were on the Guadalupe River, and that is unacceptable. That cannot happen again. And we need to better prepare for these types of storms, not only from just a receiving and providing alerts, but also the infrastructure of where things can be built, where things can go in the future. And I think that's really important discussions to have in the future, even in my community up here in Canada, in Burlington, Ontario. So I want to thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'd love to hear your feedback. You can leave a comment on the YouTube channel if you're watching this on YouTube, or if you're listening to this on your favorite podcast app, you can hit me up on my website, speakupforblue.com/contact. Leave me an email if you have any questions for myself or Dave. I'll pass it along to him. It goes right to my personal email, or you can hit me up on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. That's at How to Protect the Ocean. Just DM me. I want to thank you so much for joining us on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin from the True North Strong and Free. Have a good day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.